Bangkok, Thailand. It was Wednesday morning, March 15, 1972, approximately 9:23 a.m. local time when Frank Lucas walked into a nondescript warehouse in the Klong Toei district of Bangkok, a sprawling port area where legitimate shipping operations existed alongside smuggling networks that moved everything from stolen electronics to illegal weapons to raw opium from the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia. Lucas was dressed differently than he would have been in New York, wearing lightweight khaki pants and a loose-fitting cotton shirt that helped manage the oppressive heat and humidity of Bangkok in March, when temperatures regularly exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit and the air felt thick enough to chew. He wore sunglasses despite being indoors, partly to protect against the bright tropical sunlight that streamed through the warehouse's high windows, and partly because he'd learned over multiple trips to Southeast Asia that maintaining some anonymity was wise when conducting business in a part of the world where American drug buyers attracted attention from law enforcement agencies representing multiple countries. Lucas was accompanied by Leslie Ike Atkinson, a former U.S. Army sergeant who'd served in Vietnam and who'd stayed in Southeast Asia after his military service ended in 1968, establishing connections with Thai and Chinese smugglers who controlled the region's heroin trade. Atkinson was the key to Lucas's entire operation, the connection that allowed Lucas to bypass the Italian mob families who'd traditionally controlled heroin importation into the United States, the man who'd made it possible for Lucas to purchase heroin directly from Southeast Asian suppliers at prices that were a fraction of what the mob paid their Sicilian and Turkish sources. The economics of Lucas's operation were revolutionary in 1972, and represented the reason he'd been able to build an empire that rivaled the Italian mob's distribution networks. Traditional heroin importation in the early 1970s involved multiple layers of middlemen, each taking their cut and inflating prices. Raw opium from Turkey or Southeast Asia would be processed into heroin in laboratories in Marseille, France, creating what was known as French Connection heroin. The processed heroin would be sold to Sicilian mob families who controlled Mediterranean smuggling routes. The Sicilians would transport the heroin to the United States and sell it to American mob families at markups that reflected the risks and costs of international smuggling. The American mob families would then cut the heroin, reducing its purity from the 80 to 90% purity it had when imported down to perhaps 10 to 15% purity after being mixed with cutting agents like quinine, lactose, and mannitol. By the time heroin reached street-level dealers in New York through this traditional distribution chain, a kilogram of heroin that had cost perhaps $8,000 to produce in Marseille had passed through so many hands and been cut so many times that it generated perhaps $120,000 in street-level sales, with most of that profit going to Italian mob families who controlled each stage of the distribution process. But Frank Lucas had developed a system that eliminated most of those middlemen and dramatically reduced his costs, while simultaneously allowing him to sell higher quality product that commanded premium prices. Through Ike Atkinson's connections, Lucas purchased heroin directly from suppliers in the Golden Triangle, the mountainous region where Thailand, Laos, and Burma met, and where opium cultivation had been occurring for centuries. The heroin Lucas bought was between 90 and 95% pure, hadn't been cut or adulterated, and cost approximately $4,000 to $4,500 per kilogram when purchased in bulk quantities in Bangkok. Lucas then used Atkinson's military connections and knowledge of military shipping procedures to smuggle the heroin into the United States, hiding it in various shipments connected to the U.S. military's massive logistics operations in Southeast Asia. The details of these smuggling methods would later become legendary and disputed, with some accounts claiming Lucas hid heroin in the coffins of dead American soldiers being returned from Vietnam, though Lucas would deny these specific claims while acknowledging he used military shipping channels to transport his product. Regardless of the exact methods, what mattered was that Lucas had developed smuggling routes that were reliable, that avoided the traditional mob-controlled channels, and that had significantly lower costs and risks than conventional heroin importation. Once the heroin reached New York, Lucas could choose how much to cut it. His signature product, which he branded as Blue Magic, due to the blue tint created by the cutting agents he used, was typically cut to approximately 10% purity, similar to other heroin available on the streets. But because Lucas started with 95% pure heroin, rather than the heavily cut product the mob distributed, his Blue Magic was noticeably more potent than competing brands. Users learned that Blue Magic delivered a stronger high from smaller doses, that it was more reliable and consistent than other heroin available in Harlem, and they were willing to pay premium prices for Lucas's product even though it was nominally the same purity as what competitors sold. The warehouse in Bangkok's Klong Toei district where Lucas had arrived that Wednesday morning was owned by a Thai businessman named Somchai Pramoj, who operated several legitimate shipping companies while simultaneously facilitating drug smuggling operations for various international criminal organizations. Somchai had been working with Ike Atkinson since 1969 and had developed trust in the American's reliability and discretion. When Atkinson had first introduced Frank Lucas to Somchai in 1970, Somchai had been skeptical that a black American drug dealer could be trusted with large transactions and sensitive smuggling arrangements, but Lucas had proven himself over multiple successful purchases and shipments, and by 1972, Somchai viewed Lucas as a valued customer who paid promptly and who didn't create unnecessary complications. Somchai was waiting in the warehouse office when Lucas and Atkinson arrived, sitting behind a desk cluttered with shipping manifests and customs documents, drinking tea from a small ceramic cup, smoking a cigarette despite the early morning hour. Somchai was 53 years old in March 1972, a heavy-set man who'd spent his entire adult life in shipping and smuggling, who'd built substantial wealth by facilitating the movement of illegal goods while maintaining enough legitimate business operations to avoid serious law enforcement scrutiny. Mr. Lucas, Somchai said in heavily accented English, gesturing for Lucas and Atkinson to sit in chairs positioned across from his desk. Ike tells me you want to make a substantial purchase this trip. 10 kilograms, he said. That's larger than your usual orders. Are you expanding your operations in America? Lucas had been buying heroin from Somchai in quantities of 3 to 5 kilograms per trip, making approximately 4 trips per year to Bangkok, moving perhaps 15 to 20 kilograms annually through this supply channel. But Lucas had decided to increase his purchase quantity for this March 1972 trip for several reasons. First, his distribution network in New York had expanded significantly over the past year, with new distributors in New Jersey, Philadelphia, and Connecticut, creating demand for more product than his existing supply could fulfill. Second, Lucas had accumulated enough cash that purchasing 10 kilograms wouldn't strain his financial resources or create cash flow problems. And third, Lucas had intelligence suggesting that law enforcement agencies were intensifying their focus on heroin trafficking, potentially making future trips to Southeast Asia more risky, so buying larger quantities now while the routes were still relatively secure made strategic sense. My business is growing, Lucas replied carefully, aware that Somchai would be concerned about any changes that might indicate increased law enforcement attention or operational problems. I have new markets opening up. More distributors who want my product, more demand than I can currently supply. I'm confident I can move 10 kilograms quickly and safely, and I'd like to establish that I can handle larger quantities if we decide to increase my regular order size in the future. Somchai studied Lucas for a moment, calculating risks and benefits, considering whether selling 10 kilograms to a single buyer represented acceptable risk, or whether it created potential problems if Lucas was arrested, or if the shipment was intercepted. Finally, Somchai nodded. I can provide 10 kilograms of premium quality heroin, 94% pure, tested and verified. Standard price is $4,200 per kilogram for orders of this size, so total cost would be $42,000 US payment in cash as usual, and we arrange shipping through Ike's military channels with delivery to New York approximately 3 weeks from today. These terms are acceptable? Lucas pulled a leather briefcase from the floor beside his chair and placed it on Somchai's desk. Inside were $42,000 in U.S. currency, mostly $100 bills that Lucas had transported from New York specifically for this purchase. Carrying that much cash internationally was risky, but Lucas had developed methods for concealing money during travel, had bribed customs officials at multiple points along his route, and had successfully transported hundreds of thousands of dollars into and out of Southeast Asia over the past 2 years without being caught or questioned by authorities. Somchai opened the briefcase, examined the currency briefly without counting it because he trusted that Lucas and Atkinson wouldn't risk their relationship by shorting payment, then closed the briefcase and placed it in a safe built into the wall behind his desk. The product will be ready for shipment by Friday. Ike knows the procedures for arranging transport. The heroin will be packed in sealed containers marked as machine parts being returned to the United States for repair, will be included in a larger shipment of legitimate military supplies, will clear customs in San Francisco, and then be transported overland to New York. You should have the product by early April, probably the first week. Lucas and Atkinson stood, shook hands with Somchai in the Thai manner with a slight bow, and left the warehouse. They spent the next 2 days in Bangkok, conducting additional business, meeting with other contacts who provided various services Lucas's operation required, from document forgers who created false shipping papers to corrupt Thai customs officials who ensured Lucas's shipments weren't inspected too carefully, building and maintaining the network of relationships that made his smuggling operation possible. Lucas returned to New York on March 18, 1972, flying from Bangkok to San Francisco to New York on commercial airlines under one of several false identities he maintained specifically for international travel. He arrived at his Harlem mansion late Saturday evening, exhausted from the 30-hour journey, but satisfied that he'd secured the product he needed to meet demand for the next several months, and that his supply chain remained secure and reliable, despite increasing law enforcement attention on international drug trafficking. The heroin arrived in New York on April 3, 1972, exactly when Somchai had predicted, transported in a shipment of military equipment that cleared customs without inspection because corrupt officials had been paid to expedite the paperwork and to avoid asking questions about sealed containers that weren't supposed to be opened during routine processing. The 10 kilograms of heroin were delivered to a warehouse Lucas controlled in the Bronx, a facility that appeared to be a legitimate auto repair shop, but that actually served as one of Lucas's primary processing and distribution centers. Lucas personally supervised the initial inspection and testing of the heroin, using a small chemistry kit to verify purity and quality, confirming that Somchai had delivered exactly what had been purchased. The heroin was 94% pure as promised, had the characteristic off-white color of high-quality Southeast Asian heroin, and showed no signs of having been adulterated or contaminated during shipping. This was the raw material that would generate an extraordinary return on Lucas's $42,000 investment. Over the next 48 hours, Lucas's organization processed the 10 kilograms of heroin using methods that had been refined over years of operation. The process involved several stages that transformed the raw heroin into the street-level product that would be sold to users throughout New York and surrounding areas. First, the heroin was carefully weighed and divided into smaller batches of approximately 1 kilogram each, with each batch being processed separately to maintain quality control and to prevent the entire shipment from being ruined if mistakes were made during cutting and packaging. Each kilogram of 94% pure heroin would be cut down to approximately 10% purity, which meant each kilogram of raw heroin would produce approximately 9 kilograms of street-level product after cutting agents were added. The cutting agents Lucas used were a mixture of quinine, which gave the heroin a bitter taste users associated with quality product, lactose sugar, which added bulk and helped the heroin dissolve when users prepared injections, and mannitol, which created the smooth texture users expected. The exact ratios of these cutting agents were carefully controlled because consistency was crucial to Blue Magic's reputation. Users had learned that Blue Magic delivered reliable results, that each purchase had similar potency, and that they could count on Lucas's product to be stronger and more consistent than competing brands. The cutting process itself required skill and attention to detail. The pure heroin and cutting agents had to be mixed thoroughly to ensure even distribution, which was accomplished using mechanical mixers, similar to industrial food processing equipment. The mixture was then sifted to remove lumps and create a fine powder that could be easily packaged. Throughout this process, workers wore masks and gloves because accidental exposure to concentrated heroin could be lethal, and Lucas's operation had strict safety procedures to prevent the kind of accidents that had killed workers in other drug processing facilities. After cutting, the heroin was packaged in various quantities depending on the intended distribution channel. Some product was packaged in 1 kilogram bricks wrapped in plastic and tape, which would be sold to Lucas's major distributors who supplied street-level dealers throughout multiple cities. Other product was packaged in smaller quantities, glassine envelopes containing approximately 100 milligrams of heroin that would retail for $5 to $10 each on the streets of Harlem. The 10 kilograms of pure heroin that Lucas had purchased for $42,000 in Bangkok ultimately produced approximately 90 kilograms of street-level Blue Magic heroin after cutting. This 90 kilograms represented approximately 900,000 individual doses when packaged in glassine envelopes, each dose capable of getting a user high for several hours, each dose representing a $5 to $10 sale on the street. But Lucas didn't sell his product directly to users, and he didn't retail individual doses because street-level sales were too risky and too time-consuming for someone operating at his level. Instead, Lucas had developed a sophisticated distribution network that moved product through multiple levels before it reached end users. At the top level, Lucas sold to approximately 15 major distributors, men who controlled distribution networks in different geographic areas or different segments of the market. These major distributors purchased Blue Magic in quantities of 5 to 10 kilograms at a time, paying Lucas approximately $50,000 per kilogram of cut heroin. This represented Lucas's first level of profit, transforming his $42,000 raw material purchase into approximately $450,000 in revenue from sales to major distributors. The major distributors would then cut the heroin again, further reducing its purity from 10% down to perhaps 5 to 7%, doubling their quantity and allowing them to sell to mid-level dealers at prices that gave them substantial profit margins while still being competitive with other heroin sources. The mid-level dealers would cut the heroin yet again before selling to street-level dealers, and street-level dealers would package the heavily cut heroin into individual doses for sale to users. By the time the heroin that Lucas had purchased for $42,000 in Bangkok reached end users in Harlem, the Bronx, Brooklyn, New Jersey, and other markets, it would generate approximately $1 million in total street-level sales. Lucas himself captured roughly $500,000 of that value through his sales to major distributors, with the rest being divided among the various levels of dealers and distributors who moved the product from Lucas's warehouse to users' veins. The entire process from Lucas purchasing the heroin in Bangkok on March 15th to his organization completely selling out the 90 kilograms of cut Blue Magic to major distributors took exactly 8 days. By April 11, 1972, Lucas had collected approximately $485,000 in cash from his distributors, had replenished his inventory, had satisfied demand from distribution channels that had been waiting for new product, and had demonstrated once again why his operation was so successful and so profitable. The mathematics of Lucas's operation in March and April 1972 represented a case study in why he'd been able to build an empire that rivaled the Italian mob's distribution networks. Lucas had purchased 10 kilograms of heroin for $42,000, had invested perhaps another $8,000 in transportation costs, bribes, processing supplies, and operational expenses, and had generated $485,000 in revenue within 3 weeks of making the initial purchase. His profit on this single transaction was approximately $435,000, a return on investment of roughly 870%. The Italian mob families who'd traditionally controlled heroin distribution couldn't match these economics because they paid higher prices for their heroin, had more expensive smuggling operations, and had to divide profits among more levels of organization. A mob family purchasing the same 10 kilograms of heroin through traditional French connection channels would have paid approximately $80,000 to $100,000 for the raw material, would have had higher smuggling costs, and would have generated perhaps $550,000 in revenue after cutting and distribution, yielding profits of perhaps $300,000 to $350,000, substantially less than what Lucas earned on the same quantity of product. This economic advantage allowed Lucas to do several things that mob families couldn't easily match. First, he could sell higher quality product at competitive prices, which built customer loyalty and market share. Second, he could undercut mob prices when necessary to capture new markets or defend existing territory. Third, he could accumulate wealth faster than traditional heroin distributors, allowing him to expand operations, bribe more officials, hire better lawyers, and build the kind of protective infrastructure that made him difficult to prosecute despite law enforcement's awareness of his activities. But the March 1972 transaction that generated nearly $500,000 in profit for Lucas in just 8 days also illustrated the darker realities of his business. Those 90 kilograms of Blue Magic heroin that Lucas distributed throughout the New York metropolitan area would ultimately be injected by approximately 900,000 individual users, each dose representing someone's temporary escape from reality, someone's chemical relief from poverty or trauma or mental illness or simple boredom, someone's decision to prioritize getting high over eating or paying rent or caring for children or maintaining employment. Some of those 900,000 doses would be injected by casual users who maintained functional lives and who used heroin recreationally without becoming addicted or experiencing serious consequences. But many of those doses would be injected by people who were already addicted, who needed heroin not to get high, but to avoid the agonizing physical withdrawal symptoms that occurred when addicts stopped using, who would steal or prostitute themselves or abandon their families to get money for their next fix, who would continue using until they died from overdoses or infections or the cumulative health effects of chronic drug use. The 10 kilograms of heroin that Lucas purchased for $42,000 would directly contribute to perhaps 20 to 30 overdose deaths, based on statistical averages for heroin-related mortality in the early 1970s. It would contribute to hundreds of new addictions as casual users progressed to physical dependence. It would contribute to thousands of crimes as addicts stole to support their habits. It would contribute to family dissolutions and child neglect, and the cascading social problems that heroin addiction created in communities throughout New York. Lucas understood these consequences at some level, though he rarely acknowledged them publicly, and tended to rationalize his role by arguing that he was simply meeting market demand that would exist regardless of whether he specifically supplied it, that if he didn't sell heroin, someone else would, that addicts made their own choices about using drugs and bore responsibility for the consequences of those choices. This rationalization allowed Lucas to enjoy his wealth and success without confronting the human cost of his business, without acknowledging that his $500,000 profit from a single week of sales in April 1972 was built on a foundation of addiction, suffering, and death throughout the communities he claimed to be part of. Law enforcement agencies tracking Lucas's operations understood the human cost, even if Lucas didn't acknowledge it. The Drug Enforcement Administration, which had been created in July 1973 by merging various federal drug enforcement agencies, had been monitoring Lucas since its predecessor agencies first identified him as a major heroin distributor in the early 1970s. Federal agents had intelligence suggesting Lucas was importing significant quantities of heroin from Southeast Asia, though they didn't have the kind of detailed evidence necessary to indict him or to intercept his shipments. The March 1972 purchase that Lucas made in Bangkok didn't come to law enforcement's attention until years later, after Lucas was arrested and after investigators reconstructed his operations by examining financial records and interviewing informants. But even without knowing the specific details of this particular transaction, law enforcement understood that Lucas was operating at a scale that required direct access to Asian heroin sources, that he was moving quantities that generated millions of dollars in annual revenue, and that building a case against him was a priority for federal drug enforcement efforts. What made Lucas particularly difficult to investigate and prosecute was his operational security and his organizational structure. Lucas maintained strict separation between different levels of his operation, so street-level dealers didn't know who supplied their mid-level dealer bosses, and mid-level dealers didn't know the major distributors who supplied them, and major distributors had limited direct contact with Lucas himself. This compartmentalization meant that arresting low-level people in Lucas's organization didn't provide evidence or testimony that could be used against Lucas personally. Additionally, Lucas was extremely careful about electronic surveillance. He rarely used telephones for sensitive conversations, avoided discussing business in locations where law enforcement might have installed listening devices, used code words and indirect language when communication was necessary, and changed his communication methods regularly to prevent law enforcement from developing reliable intelligence about his operations. Lucas also invested heavily in counter-surveillance and security. He employed people whose only job was to watch for law enforcement surveillance, to identify undercover officers, to detect wiretaps and bugs, to provide early warning if investigations were targeting his operations. He bribed corrupt police officers who provided information about ongoing investigations. He paid informants inside law enforcement agencies who warned him about planned raids or arrests. This security infrastructure made it extremely difficult for law enforcement to gather evidence, without Lucas becoming aware of their investigation and taking countermeasures. But despite all of Lucas's precautions and security measures, the fundamental reality was that operating a major heroin distribution network required transactions with hundreds of people, required physical movement of product and money, required enough visibility that law enforcement eventually accumulated the evidence necessary for prosecution. Lucas's elaborate security infrastructure bought him time and allowed him to operate successfully for longer than most major drug dealers managed, but it couldn't prevent the inevitable collapse that occurred when federal authorities decided to commit sufficient resources to destroying his organization. The 10 kilograms that Lucas purchased for $42,000 in March 1972 and sold for nearly $500,000 in April 1972 represented Lucas at the peak of his operational efficiency and profitability. His supply chain was functioning smoothly. His distribution network was expanding. His product had developed a reputation for quality that commanded premium prices, and his security measures were effective enough to keep law enforcement from building prosecutable cases despite their awareness of his activities. But this peak period was also the beginning of the end, because the same success and profitability that made March and April 1972 so lucrative for Lucas also made him a priority target for federal law enforcement, attracted attention from rival criminal organizations who wanted to either copy his methods or eliminate him as competition, and created the kind of visibility that would eventually lead to his arrest and conviction just 3 years later. The $500,000 that Lucas earned in 8 days from a $42,000 investment represented extraordinary profit by any measure, demonstrated the economic power of direct sourcing and efficient distribution, illustrated why Lucas had been able to build an empire that challenged the Italian mob's traditional dominance of heroin trafficking. But that same transaction represented suffering for thousands of people, represented death and addiction, and destroyed families, represented the dark reality that Lucas's wealth and success were built on a business model that extracted maximum profit from human weakness and human suffering. Frank Lucas bought 10 kilograms of heroin for $42,000 in Bangkok in March 1972, processed and cut that heroin into 90 kilograms of Blue Magic, sold it all to his distribution network for approximately $500,000 within 8 days of receiving the shipment, and demonstrated both the brilliance of his business model and the tragedy of an enterprise that generated extraordinary wealth for its operators while creating extraordinary suffering for the communities it served. That single transaction, multiplied dozens of times over the years Lucas operated his empire, represented both his greatest achievement as a criminal entrepreneur and his greatest crime as a human being who chose profit over the well-being of the people whose addictions funded his lavish lifestyle and his legendary status in New York's criminal underworld.